As always, I'm your host, Herschel J. Grandgent Jr., aka Herschel Jr., the voice. And this week is a special edition of The Corner. Although, as I say that out loud, I feel some kind of way about using the word special. At the time of this recording, there have now been protests, and some of them have been violent, literally throughout the world, following the in-custody death of Mr. George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's the culmination, in my opinion, of so many deaths of black and brown people at the hands of police over the course of so many years. I normally try to do something kind of fun and interesting to make it into a show topic, but with the climate of what's going on right here and right now, I felt like it was my duty to use my platform, as small as it may be, to sit down and talk about this. Now, a lot of times a disclaimer will be put on the screen saying something like, the views expressed do not reflect those of the station, blah, blah, blah. But I own the station, so this is all me. And I may lose a friend or two once this is over, but that just means we were never friends to begin with. And I have to say I'm okay with that. Now, before I set forth to even begin to speak on the subject, I had to sit down and reflect and do some real soul searching to make sure that I had the right to even open my mouth. And yet that does sound strange, I'm sure, because I am a black man in America. But what everyone may not know, especially if you've only known me for the last few years or so, is that once upon a time, I wore a badge myself. I was a police officer here in Metro Atlanta for a number of years. And I saw some very ugly things. And a couple times I had to do some things that normal citizens wouldn't even dream of doing under the guise of enforcing the law. So before I sat down in this chair to even speak on this subject, I had to look at myself and make sure that in those years of enforcing the law that I did what was right. Did I treat everyone right? Did I treat everyone like human beings, regardless of what neighborhood or skin color or language they spoke? And if the answer was no, even once, then I was part of the problem. I had added my own little drop of fuel to the fire that was ready to erupt into what we've seen over the past week or so. But if the answer was without a doubt, unequivocally, yes, then and only then did I have the right to open my mouth. And after several days of reflecting, and I realized I could honestly say yes. I treated everybody with respect. Now, if somebody provoked me or talked to me nasty for no reason, then yeah, I'm not going to lie, there were times that I would give it back to them. But that's just human nature. And if somebody put their hands on me or a citizen or another officer, then yes, I would put my hands on them. But it was within the boundaries of training and human decency. So when I think about Mr. Floyd and the fact that over a forgery call, a call that I responded to a number of times, a call that never involved any kind of violence, a call that, if I'm remembering the handbook correctly, is handled by arriving on the scene, taking the subject into custody, placing them in the back of your car, and doing your report while you wait for the fraud detectives to arrive. To know that he lost his life over that, it just boggles the mind. Now, I wasn't there, and I don't know all the facts. Hell, full disclosure, I couldn't even finish the video of what happened to him. And one thing we were always taught was to never Monday morning quarterback another officer, but some things are just too obvious not to comment on if it's a subject that you have knowledge of. Even if he was combative, and we've all had combative handcuffed suspects, he was handcuffed. Officers had the upper hand. And anytime there's more than one officer and the subject is handcuffed, then you have all the power. Even if he was in the car whining about being claustrophobic, we've all had that happen too. Just crack his window and let him whine. It's annoying, but he lives in the end. They should never have taken him out of the car, but if they felt it was necessary, again, he was handcuffed. Grab him by the handcuffs and push him up against the car until he calms down. Lay him on the grass on his stomach and just keep an eye on him. He's not going anywhere. I mean, it's almost the human equivalent of a turtle being on its back, you know? But the knee and the neck, that's no excuse. I was taught a method of getting people under control that involved putting a knee on the shoulder, but it was strictly a handcuffing technique, and it didn't involve putting your full weight on the person to the point that they lost consciousness. And once the cuffs were on, the knee was removed. I have a lot of officers and former officers I know and have spoken with, and they all agree with me on that one. As for the other officers who were on the scene, yeah, they're all at fault too. Anytime you see a procedure not being followed, anytime you see a citizen being hurt or mistreated by a colleague, then it's your duty to say, hey man, that's enough. That's not how we do it. They had every opportunity during the almost 9 minutes, the last 9 minutes of that man's life, to say or do something. I mean, yeah, they got fired. Anyone who's been a cop any amount of time knows that, yes, you will get fired just for being there. But legally speaking, they bear the responsibility and they need to be incarcerated too. I mean, think about it this way. If my friend breaks into a house and me and another friend just happen to tag along, we don't touch anything, we don't steal anything, but the old lady who owns the house sees us and gets scared to the point that she has a heart attack and dies, then we all get charged with murder. Why? We were present during the commission of a felony that resulted in the death and did nothing to stop it. So we're liable. That's the same for these cops. Yeah, former officer Chauvin, however you pronounce it, he had a long history of this type of behavior, by the way. I mean, he's in custody, and I pray that justice is served. And I pray for this country if it's not served. So many people have condemned these brave men and women who have taken it upon themselves to go out and protesting this injustice and all the injustices that have come before them. I mean, people from our so-called commander-in-chief down to leaders of local municipalities have all condemned the people who are protesting for justice. And although I don't condone destruction and certainly not stealing, because I've had some friends who are business owners who've been victims of it, I certainly don't condone it. It's kind of like Chris Rock was saying. I mean, I'm not saying you should have done it, but I certainly understand why you feel that way. But why in 2020 is there still such a disparity between black and brown people, how they protest and how white people protest? Colin Kaepernick silently took a knee, lost a whole career, and was referred to as a son of a bitch who deserves to be fired. But an angry mob with tiki torches who incite violence and drive cars into crowds of people are referred to as very good people. What bothers you more? Angry right protesters in Michigan demanding that the state open up because it's their God-given right to get coronavirus? Or images of demonstrators setting buildings on fire while they protest the death of George Floyd, These guys in Michigan, they were armed with assault rifles, bulletproof vests, and the National Guard was never called. They were never dispatched. Meanwhile, people in Minneapolis, they're demanding criminal charges for a murderous officer and found themselves a couple steps away from martial law. And people still get so upset simply because of the name of the group, Black Lives Matter. The only issue I have with Black Lives Matter is that they gave themselves a name that caused the ignorant and self-absorbed to have to think in order to have the name make sense to them. Oh, they said Black Lives Matter. They're saying mine doesn't. That's not fair. All lives matter. And in the grand scheme of things, yeah, they do. But I want you to think about this. Black folks have demanded for so long that the government and police forces do something about police brutality against black people and just violence in general against unarmed black people. And after a while, it became clear they don't realize that we're citizens too. They don't realize that we care about and contribute to this country. Hell, we built it with our bare hands. They don't realize that we matter. So the distinction had to be made. Black lives matter too. And it's a shame. Comedian Michael Che, he said it best. He said, it's a shame that we're fighting for matters. Not the best in the world, not the most important, just matters. We just want to matter. When somebody uses all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, it's like one house in the neighborhood's on fire and the firefighters start putting water on that house. And then the neighbors start to complain, hey, you're not putting water on my house. Yeah, he's right. All houses matter. I mean, we think about it that way. Does it make any sense? We're also dealing with a global pandemic that has proven to affect more people of color than initially thought. And yet, despite the risk, many black people still took to the streets across the country, across the world, to protest the killings of Mr. Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the black EMT worker who was shot and killed in her house in Kentucky. And the police killings and the coronavirus, they're only made worse by the dialogue of our so-called leaders. And if you loot and destroy, you lose all moral credibility in my eyes to protest injustice. That was conservative activist Charlie Kirk. He said that recently. And then our First Lady, our country allows for peaceful protest, but there's no reason for violence, she says. But if you look at the long list of why white people riot, it includes their sports team winning, their sports team losing, a Tickle Me Elmo or some other kind of toy, or being mad because people that don't look like them want to go to school with them. Meanwhile, we got a president saying that looters should be shot, using a quote from Walter Hatley, a Miami police chief from the 60s, who routinely used violence against black protesters. All this rhetoric, it suggests that the goal is looting and violence instead of peaceful protest, but what's happening in Minneapolis and here in Atlanta and LA and New York and other parts of the country, other parts of the world, it's a last resort as far as these groups are concerned. And I understand that completely. Again, I don't condone violent protests, but when you get collectively beaten down for so long, you can't expect somebody not to retaliate. And the majority are going to be blamed for what the minority is doing, sadly. Priorities in America, they're just all over the place. And first comes white health and safety and property and economy, then white comfort, and the safety of black and brown people, the right to not be killed when you're not a threat, the right to not be pepper sprayed or gassed while a respiratory disease is ripping through the community that's miles behind other people's comfort. The president called the armed Michigan protesters, he called them very good people. That's one of his favorite phrases, it seems. But what did he call the Minnesota protesters? He called them thugs. And if you're sick of talking about it, trust me, so am I. But if you're sick of talking about it, sick of hearing about it, that just means you're paying attention to it. This isn't the first or the last time we'll talk about the right for black and brown people to protest. It's already been made clear that peaceful protest is an issue. I already mentioned Colin Kaepernick kneeling to protest deaths like Mr. Floyd's. Like Vice President Pence, he left a football game in 2017, left mad as hell because some of the players were kneeling during the national anthem. So peaceful protest was too much for them. Protesting peacefully without destroying property or hurting anybody is still an issue. So if kneeling is too disruptive to your precious faculties, then what do we do to show how upset we are about a system and a country that still doesn't care about our lives? If a black reporter can get arrested while he's doing his job, What hope is there for anybody else who doesn't have CNN backing them up? Fires and looting. I mean, they're rarely the first thing that somebody wants to do if they're upset. It's not on the top of their list when they go out there to protest injustice. But for as upset as people got about a Target store, they weren't nearly as upset about Target, the multi-billion-dollar company that it is, not giving its employees the proper protective equipment to protect them from coronavirus. And no one said anything about all the small businesses in the area that are affected by rioting, which, I mean, they were already, of course, affected by COVID-19 shutdowns as well. I read about an owner of a restaurant in Minneapolis who posted on his Facebook page in support of the protesters. He said, even though our restaurant was one of the ones burned, let my building burn. Justice needs to be served. Put those officers in jail. So what's the truth in all this? What have we learned? Nothing we didn't already know. If one group of protesters gets arrested, they're going to be handled with kid gloves. But another group of protesters, they'll be faced with cops in riot gear and who knows what else, whether they come out there peacefully or not. One group protesting with guns over the right to reopen has received more favorable rating than a group of people simply protesting for the right to live. And I'll let you guess which group is which. Martin Luther King said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." And we all know these protests didn't just come out of nowhere. The history of black humanity being pushed to the rear, that's what brought it to the forefront. Be safe, family. I love you. Wish you nothing but the best as we attempt to, once again, get through this. Again, this has been Herschel J. Grangent Jr., and this has been a special modified edition of The Corner. I thank you for listening. Please like and share, and be sure to hit the notification button so you can get our latest episodes. And I will see you next week.